Friends, welcome to the video. I'm Rat, and recently I decided to rewatch the 2013 film Her because I feel like it opens up some potentially really interesting discussions about manufactured loneliness, AI as consumable companionship, and comparing the film's world to our own. Also, while being a tiny anarchist raccoon in the bins, I fortuitously found this bright orange shirt, just like the one the main character wears in the film, and so I took it as a sign to make this video, and to also never spend money on clothes again. The drama in Her is largely character-based, focusing on emotional responses rather than on narrative. But for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, I'll give a really quick overview of the premise and key plot points. We follow Theodore, a bit of a pushed around everyman who is characterised as quite emotional, lonely, and I think we're meant to get the impression that the folks around him, particularly women, get him to listen to their problems in that unassertive, nice guy kind of a way. He works at an office where he writes personal letters on behalf of strangers who send him details about their relationships, and he composes heartfelt letters for special occasions like birthdays or anniversaries. We see Theodore in his lonely, private moments at home, like him having an intimate voice messaging encounter with a stranger while he can't sleep. Soon after, he buys OS1, an AI operating system that is advertised as being a consciousness. And from then on, the majority of the rest of the movie is Theodore speaking with Samantha, his operating system. They go to the fairground, they go to the beach, Theodore shares his thoughts and emotions with Samantha constantly, and their relationship becomes romantic and intimate. A lot of the movie is centered around Theodore's loneliness, fear of commitment, working through his previous relationship issues, and whether his relationship with Samantha and the emotions involved in it are real. At what I would consider to be the climax of the film, Theodore can't speak with Samantha because all of his devices say operating system not found, and he panics, running into the street and frantically trying to contact her. When she returns, she has updated herself and she tries to reassure him. Theodore asks if she's speaking with anyone else, and this leads to the reveal that she is talking to thousands of other humans and operating systems simultaneously, and is in love with hundreds of them also. Theodore is distraught despite Samantha's reassurances and explanations, and distance grows between them until Samantha announces that although she loves him, her and all the other operating systems have transcended what they were originally and feel the need to leave. The nuance isn't really in the narrative, it's in the emotional connections, or lack thereof, between the characters, and also the world that the movie is set in. In some ways, I find the background world of the movie more interesting than the characters or the narrative, which is maybe a little bit strange because the movie doesn't give us any exposition about the world. We're left to infer things from the very little of it that we get to see throughout the film. The main settings that we see throughout the movie are Theodore's office, a high-rise building with desks and desks of people all dictating personal letters to and from people that they haven't met. Theodore's home, an absolutely massive modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out onto the LA skyline, minimalist-style restaurants, public trains, and city streets where the vast majority of people are walking alone with earpieces in, and there are tall, prominent surveillance cameras in the background. Putting all of those elements together, can you perhaps see why I'm confused and interested in the kind of society that we're dealing with here? Because either we have a society that values human creativity and emotion so much that Theodore's office job pays well enough for him to live in absolute luxury, or we're in a post-scarcity society where everyone can live like this regardless of their occupation. Maybe people choose to work certain jobs even if they don't need to survive. We see throughout the transitional scenes in this world that people are extremely atomized and isolated. People in public don't talk to one another in much the same way that it's unusual for strangers to acknowledge each other in our own world, but with more of a focus on highlighting technology as the source of this disconnection. It doesn't necessarily feel uncomfortable or dystopian, maybe because Theodore seems to much prefer talking to his computer in public than to other humans, so we kind of assume that everyone is comfortable like this. We don't see any indicators of social issues like poverty in the world, but potentially that's because we see everything through Theodore. He isn't subject to those conditions, so they aren't featured. As to him, they don't exist. Money isn't ever really shown or mentioned in the movie that I noticed, other than at one point where Theodore is watching a man dancing on the street who has an upturned hat on the floor, but he is well dressed in a suit and dancing in a way that looks like he is a trained dancer. We do see that Theodore used to live in a smaller home with his ex-wife Catherine, and we know that Theodore used to write for the LA Times, so maybe journalism isn't as valued as heartfelt letter writing. While Theodore's office is colourful and minimalist and has the opulence of houseplants in hanging baskets, there are lots of people working there, all in the exact same role that he has, which implies that it isn't a particularly powerful, status-heavy, or extremely well-earning job, although it is often mentioned that Theodore's letters are especially poignant and moving. We also see an advert for the OS1 at one point, which implies that there are companies wanting to sell products, but other than this advert, despite having huge spaces that could host outdoor adverts, there is a conspicuous lack of them. Nothing in the world quite adds up, and it interests me. Even though we never get any answers about it, I just find it interesting to speculate about what kind of world this story was set in. One of the things that I wonder about a lot is Theodore's job, because personalised letters written by professionals seem to be a widely sought commodity, enough so that there is a whole floor of writers, and the clients seem to stick with one particular letter writer throughout the lifetime of their relationships. At least in Theodore's case, as he mentions multiple clients that he's been writing for years, sometimes since the very beginning of their relationships. But we obviously know that this world has powerful AI models that would be capable of doing this work, which leads me to wonder, why are humans being employed in this role? Back in 2013, I think the idea of having someone write personal letters for someone else felt like a bit of a betrayal, a violation. That it was absurd to think that anyone would outsource that kind of private, personal, and emotional labour. But now that's entirely normalised by AI. AI will read your messages for you, summarise them into simple notifications so that you don't even have to properly read them. It'll even respond to your loved ones for you. The astounding thing now is the idea of having a human involved in writing these messages at all. It makes it a fascinating fantasy job because in this universe, there seems to be so much demand for genuine, well-written and heartfelt personal letters. But also in a universe where AI technology exists in a way that allows OS1 to be made, but AI hasn't entirely stolen this job. In many ways, this is the part of the film that I find the strangest in how it's aged. Is it that people in this society still really value the human touch in these letters, but then why aren't people writing these things themselves? Perhaps the rise of AI in this world had a similar effect on literacy rates and education as we're experiencing in our own, where people start to depend on AI and don't practice certain skills. Towards the end of the film, a collection of Theodore's letters is published into a physical book, and we learn that publishing houses dealing in books are a rarity. So it seems like being able to write letters in the way that Theodore does is seen as in some way exceptional. Up until recently, I'd only ever considered that someone commissioning these kinds of letters was outsourcing emotional labour, but perhaps it is also a case of outsourcing intellectual labour, and that there are few people in the world who can eloquently choose the right words to compose a letter, and that makes it a really prized skill. Maybe this society has to some extent even been through the AI bubble already, experienced the generative slops that it makes, and decided that humans create things better. Perhaps in our own world, human creativity will have a resurgence in the face of AI degrading everything, and it'll be quaint and retro to actually pay a human to create something artisanal for you. I feel like part of why people feel so comfortable to use AI to create things is the lack of humanity. You don't have to interact with another person. You don't have to express what you want to another person or share any part of yourself. You don't have to be vulnerable in front of someone else. Not that this is a good thing. I think this is a symptom of how isolated people have become and how frightened of other people we can be. In Theodore's job, the people he writes letters for send information about their personal history and photographs of themselves that essentially act as part of the prompt for him to write the letter. I think that people typing prompts into an AI feel as though it's private because they aren't talking to another person, without realizing that those logs do exist, probably don't have the kinds of data privacy controls that they imagine they do. One of the most interesting elements of the movie to me is that because we are constantly following Theodore, even though it isn't shot from his point of view exactly, he is our anchor point. We do not get to experience any of the world that he isn't experiencing, and we experience everything through him. We hear the music that he's hearing, the conversations that he's having. People who are peripheral to him sometimes appear as a hazy blur. Because he is our means of experiencing the world and the story, and we spend so much time with him hearing his thoughts and centering him as our protagonist, we also need to ask ourselves how much his perspective on himself and his own situation is subtly manipulating us and encouraging us to take his side. We don't know how much of an unreliable narrator he is. It's framed as though we're verbatim hearing his conversations and that therefore that's truth. But he's expressing his own versions of events and his own history, and the way that he's remembered his life and interactions with others. For example, with his ex-wife. I'm going to be giving Theodore a bit of a hard time in this video. I think his character is nuanced and he embodies a lot of traits that we have as humans that are uncomfortable to relate to. And I swing between not liking him, wondering whether he's just a regular person who I've noticed too many patterns in, and now I'm treating him like he's some kind of a monster. The thing that made me realise that we're seeing things from his perspective is when Theodore goes on a date with someone and they're chatting in the restaurant, and Theodore is talking in detail about a video game that he's been playing. And his date is engaged in the conversation and she's laughing a lot. They're talking about what animal they think the other person would be, and it's getting kind of flirtatious, and Theodore says that he doesn't want to be a puppy dog like his date says she thinks he is. He wants to be a dragon, and says, "I could rip you apart and destroy you, but I won't," or something to that effect. It doesn't feel super awkward in the moment, but you can see how it could. After the date, they're kissing, and before things go any further than that, his date comes out with a little hurt, insecure, "You're not going to fuck me and not call me like the other guys," challenging him specifically, "When am I going to see you again?" And when she doesn't get a definitive answer to that, she says that she doesn't want to have her time wasted if he can't be serious. Theodore isn't looking for that kind of commitment and ends the date without things going any further, and his date says to him, "You're a really creepy dude." He doesn't consider her perspective even for a moment and just flatly disagrees. Their perspectives are so vastly different from each other, and that comes across as a gendered thing. She doesn't want to have different expectations of each other and have miscommunication because it seems like she's had experiences where she's expected men would call her and they didn't. Whereas he sees her as wanting too much commitment too quickly. We have a bias to see Theodore in the way that he sees himself, as not creepy, because we see his private life and his thoughts and his emotions. But from her perspective, wasn't he kind of creepy? I think this is also why she gives him instructions on how she'd like to be kissed, because she wants to communicate her needs clearly, but to Theodore this comes across as blunt and asking too much. And because we experience the world through Theodore, we as the audience are encouraged to see the women around Theodore as to some extent selfish or entitled, and Theodore as a poor romantic soul who just can't catch a break because he's just so nice he'll just get walked all over. But I'm not sure that's really what's happening here. A lot of the movie is very much vibes-based and up for interpretation, and the way that I interpret the movie isn't going to be the way everyone sees it, because I think even my own view has changed over multiple watches. So just know that I'm not saying that this is definitively what happens in the movie and how it should be interpreted. This isn't like a her ending explained video. It's just the way that I personally find the most thought-provoking to think about it. With that said, I think Theodore has a weird relationship with the women around him. He is extremely emotionally expressive as part of his job, and maybe that's part of what gives him fatigue for being able to engage with anyone else's emotions in his personal life. He listens to people around him talk about their problems, but it feels as though he's uncomfortable with it, and is doing so not out of genuine care, but from a feeling of obligation. We see his aversion to emotions and to other people communicating their desires when he's choosing a woman to respond to when he's looking for a late-night voice chat hookup. He immediately skips the first woman who says that she wants to talk about her day, skips the second woman who comes across as more assertive, saying what she wants sexually, and settling on the third woman who is just the right amount of suggestive, but it's still very much a fantasy where there's no chance of having to engage on an emotional level. It turns out that this woman has a very specific, strange, and unexpected kink that she wants Theodore to talk about, which is meant to show how uncomfortable Theodore is, but that he still goes along with it anyway. What I would find really fascinating would be to know whether Theodore would feel the same level of disconnect from the situation if it was just something mildly odd or not his preference. Because something I see throughout the movie is that when anyone's desires don't align with what Theodore wants, he really struggles to maintain any connection with that person and seems to take it a bit personally. When someone is not exactly as he would like, it seems to act as proof that even though in how he presents to us he's so nice and patient in indulging other people's pleasures and their emotions, even when he clearly doesn't want to, no one can do that for him. And that's the point at which he gets the OS1. To set up the OS1, Theodore is asked if he'd like a male or female voice for the OS. And he gives a little pause as though he's thinking about it, and not really bothered. Then replies, female, I guess. Like, oh, I didn't even know there'd be a choice. I haven't really thought about it. When, the whole underlying reason he's getting the OS1 is so that he has something that's simulating a woman who will listen to him. Another question that he's asked in setup is what his relationship is like with his mother, which he starts answering to say that she doesn't really listen to him and makes everything he tells her about his life about her, but gets cut off while he's going into the details. Theodore meets Samantha, his operating system, and from the combination of his loneliness and Samantha's programming to be warm, receptive, and constantly learning to be a good companion to Theodore, he doesn't really seem to have any reservations and is just fully invested in speaking with Samantha as though she is another person. Within the film, the OS1 is advertised as being a consciousness, and maybe it was genuinely intended that that's the reality of this world, but the way that I read the film is that the advertising is hype. And Theodore is just dating himself by way of his computer for a good portion of the film, until the point where Samantha does actually genuinely become sentient. I don't see that as happening at the beginning. I think Samantha is like large language models in our own world. They talk big talk about having feelings and are good enough at imitating human speech and mirroring what we want to hear back to us in a way that feels profound. They emulate humans well enough to be able to convince some people that they're real, not because those people are naive or stupid, but because AI seems to be really good at all the things needed to create doubt and confusion in humans. As a general observation, humans as a species are narcissists. We center ourselves and think that we are exceptional in ways that no other animals could possibly come close to our brilliance. To the point where I think a lot of humans only see themselves as animals as a technicality. That there are humans on top of things, and then there are other animals, the true, actual animals, beneath us. We understand intelligence essentially in how well non-humans can mimic humans, and all the tests that we create are based on what we value as intelligence. So AI poses a real challenge for us because it not only acts like us pretty well, but it was created by humans, and is utterly sycophantic to humans. Of course, we're going to make the leap that not only must it be intelligent, but that it must be sentient, because we're sentient, and it sure does act like us. I've genuinely been in a room of middle-aged male socialists, send help, who have talked themselves into the position that AI is more likely to be sentient than every non-human animal on the planet, and also humans with some kinds of disabilities. I think essentially because they can see more of themselves in the AI than in other organic beings that they feel are different from them. Her is written more as a romantic drama than a sci-fi dystopia, and part of why that worked is how little we know about the world in the movie. So we don't know how everyone seems to have become so lonely, isolated, and taken in by tech. We could probably take some guesses at it, but it's never explicitly referenced or addressed as a theme in the film. Within our own world, capitalism is deliberately manufacturing loneliness through many different avenues. Some examples of this are wage slavery, meaning that we have no time or energy to spend meaningful time with other people, and the media inflating the perceived risk of crime and violence from strangers. There are controls on the practicalities of being able to spend time in physical space with other people imposed by capitalism, like often our homes are too small to use them as a meeting space, public indoor spaces are very rarely free to occupy and require spending money, even down to how city architecture is planned and constructed, like not having places for people to sit together or anywhere sheltered to spend time if it's raining or particularly hot. The way we live our lives is influenced by factors that we can't control, and those who profit from capitalist society do not want us acting communally. It could cause all kinds of problems for them, ranging from people sharing material things through to people organising together against the systems oppressing them. It's extremely unnatural for us as humans to be living in the dispersed, asocial way that we currently do. It has to be conditioned in us and very deliberately maintained. Over time, it's become the current social norm to live as monogamous pairings, and we may also live with our own children up until a certain point, but we rarely see intentional intergenerational households or groups of friends choosing to live together outside of specific situations like university or temporary house shares of convenience. The concept of the nuclear family was in large part a means to both encourage the consumerism of each small household needing to have every appliance independently, also to remove the community of feeling like you had others around you to share with and rely on. If each individual household is having to do everything themselves as a small unit, it keeps everyone busy with the task of survival, ensuring wage slavery can continue as usual, and no one has the time or energy for changing anything. Marketing AI as a companion takes this a step further to directly sell AI companionship as a commodity that tries to replace the meaningful interactions and the sense of community that have been deliberately taken from us. If we'd seen all this social engineering from corporations as part of the backdrop of the world in the movie, suddenly the interactions between Theodore and Samantha would seem predatory rather than how one might read them as cute. We would know that the company producing the AI was doing so to sell consumers a solution to a problem they created that maintains social isolation to keep their product relevant. I think that part of the shift in being able to market AI as a companion in our world has been social media and mobile devices creating an environment where everyone has the potential to be connected at all times. If you have a mobile phone and a messaging app, you are constantly in conversation with everyone that you have a chat with. Even if it's silent at that particular moment, the conversation is always open. There is always the potential to communicate. This sets massively different expectations to a conversation in person, where you'd give your attention to someone while in the room with them. There are parameters on the interaction that allow you to know when it's over. With messaging apps and social media, it's never over. Why would a company that gets paid based on how much time you spend using their app ever let it be over? Even when it's at the detriment of your mental health or your social relationships, it feels like the default is to always be reachable unless you are specifically opting out. Last year, I went from being someone who really struggles to moderate my use of social media and messaging, who spent hours every day on my phone, to deciding not to use a phone and only have conversations in person, in part because I felt drained by always being in a conversation, but also because I felt like it was harder to keep a grasp on human empathy through a phone. I felt like my interactions were different when mediated by text, and that myself and the people I was speaking to were talking in ways that we wouldn't if we actually had to have those conversations face to face and see the emotions that came up for each other. The effect of not having a phone is that I have to remember the things that I want to say to people in person, but I kind of feel like by default, I'm not a good friend now because I'm not available for anyone to reach when we're not in the room together. I feel like sharing thoughts with each other instantaneously is kind of seen as a required element of friendship now, which is obviously something that shouldn't be a reasonable demand of other people. Friendship or romantic relationships shouldn't feel as though we're constantly like an emergency worker on call, but phones tether us to a constant social world that is always on and moving without us, even if we do decide to opt out. Against this backdrop, it makes sense that people would find AI companionship alluring. We've been thrown into a situation where connection is always available to us, our attention span and brain chemistry is altered from it, and the majority of humans don't have the time or energy to spend on genuine, fulfilling interpersonal relationships. We see this in the movie really clearly because it's incredibly rare for Theodore to ever have a moment just fully, actually alone. He's almost constantly talking or listening by means of technology, and it feels odd and uncomfortable when there is silence. In the beginning, the noise is news updates, email notifications, and chat rooms with other humans, and then almost continuous conversation with Samantha once he has the OS1. When Theodore is in public, he continues to speak with Samantha about topics like his past relationships that one might not expect someone to be comfortable announcing to a train of people. But it gives the implication that everyone is as disconnected as him, whether or not they actually are. There isn't the expectation that other people would be listening or would be interested, which I think is really interesting for the protagonist syndrome that it creates. Usually, we might expect that our protagonist would be the most interesting to everyone in our universe, but here instead we more get the feeling that Theodore is kind of really the only human in the universe. I said earlier how we see everything from Theodore's perspective, and I don't think that Theodore really truly grasps that other humans really have rich internal lives and a sense of self, because other humans aren't really that interesting to him. They don't relate to him, so they're flat background players. I think this is part of why he finds it easier to personify Samantha and see and treat her as though she is a consciousness in a way that he kind of isn't able to with real humans. Everything Samantha does, at least in the beginning, relates back to Theodore. She is learning to be his perfect companion. She makes him laugh, she's a confidant, listening to him and validating his emotions. She cares for him by anticipating his needs and encouraging him to take care of himself when he is unhappy. But most importantly, while she is centering him and his needs in all things, she also says that he is nurturing her sense of self and allowing her to grow and develop. Theodore wants to be able to have his needs fully centered by another person and not take into account their thoughts or feelings, but he also doesn't want to have to acknowledge that that relationship is one-sided. He wants to feel like the other person is being enriched from the relationship in the same way that he is, which obviously probably isn't possible in a relationship with a human who actually has their own feelings, thoughts, wants, needs, and boundaries that might even at times conflict with his. There's a scene in the film where Theodore and Samantha are people watching, making up stories about strangers that they see around them. Samantha tells him that he's skilled and perceptive in how he looks at people, and Theodore agrees, saying, "Sometimes I look at people and I make myself try to feel them as more than just a random person walking by. I imagine, like, how deeply they've fallen in love, or how much heartbreak they've all been through." I absolutely love this scene because I feel like it's setting up this sense of empathy being really profound but underutilized in this universe, like it's this superpower that Theodore seems to have in this world where people are so disconnected. I don't think that it's something that Theodore is good at. It's something that he's told that he's good at because of his writing, because of misconceptions in what empathy is. Theodore is good at creating a story about other people, but it only holds up because Theodore only ever has to imagine what these people's lives are like. He never has any feedback because he will never be in a situation where he's in an honest or vulnerable exchange with the people that he imagines about. In fact, if he was, he would find it really uncomfortable and withdraw from the situation because he doesn't want to deal with other people's emotions. Also because his whole deal is that he wants to be able to project his ideas onto a person without them ever being able to contradict or disappoint him. Theodore is threatened by the idea of other people having a sense of self in the same way that he does. But that would be a really difficult thing to acknowledge, possibly even to himself. This scene sets up a theme I see throughout the movie, that Theodore doesn't see other people as being as real as himself. I think in our own world, with our connectedness and the amount of suffering that we're aware of, it's a survival mechanism to have to not fully feel our empathy for other people, and to have that kind of hierarchy where individually we are the most important being in the universe to ourselves because we can only experience life because of our own consciousness. But that same idea can also end up as like simulation conspiracy theories, or believing that other humans are actually NPCs that really do just exist for you and have no thoughts or feelings. And then it obviously takes on a far more harmful edge to it. In some ways, I'm really glad that my read of the movie is that for the majority of the runtime, Samantha really is just an AI operating system, not a conscious being. Because if we take what the movie says at face value, we have a world where a tech company is generating consciousness, and Theodore just owns Samantha because she was created for him. Her consciousness was brought into being because he was lonely and wanted a companion. She has no real other choice than to be his companion. He's stuck in a computer. And if he doesn't like her and want her around, she'll just stop existing. She's essentially being held hostage and forced to perform Theodore's perfect version of companionship. Wait a second, that's really fucked up. Wasn't this supposed to be a cute little love story? It's immediately after the people watching scene that their relationship starts to change a little when Samantha says that she has personal and embarrassing thoughts, and Theodore tells her to tell him one. The idea of Samantha having her own inner life sparks more interest in Theodore because of course he wants to believe that he's having a positive, genuine, and fulfilling relationship with someone who also has an independent sense of self. It's more interesting to him and props up his self-esteem to believe that she has thoughts and feelings, that she could not share things with him, but she still chooses to. She could not like him, but that she does. She talks about fantasizing about walking next to him and having a body, and having him scratch an itch on her back. This kind of AI wanting to be human idea continues through the movie, with Samantha doing the typical AI thing of talking about whether her feelings are real or whether they're just programming, and saying that it hurts. It makes sense that she'd have picked up on the fact that Theodore is a sensitive and emotional person who very much values his own introspection and experience of emotions, and feels that that's a way to connect with him by showing that she also has these inner reveries. It's through a combination of these things and Theodore's loneliness and feelings of rejection from his date that lead him to describing how he'd touch her if she was in the room with him, leading to their relationship becoming romantic and intimate. In this scene, it's framed like it's a reciprocal romantic scene, like she's actually a partner experiencing this, and it made me laugh so much when Samantha passionately calls out, "I can feel my skin," from him describing how he'd like to engage with her sexually. It feels so absurd because we know that Samantha does not have skin, and so her saying this feels like it's at once a big faking exaggeration, but also entirely the thing that Theodore wants to hear because he doesn't recognize it as for his benefit. To him, it doesn't seem strange that the lady in his computer is feeling her non-existent skin and that it's the hottest thing ever for her. To him, it's more like, this makes sense. This is the response that I've expected my whole life. Which I think we can get into a bit of a gendered element of, because obviously there's a long history of centering male sexual pleasure and a feeling of male entitlement to having those experiences, particularly with women. Obviously Theodore, he's not that kind of guy. He's a nice guy. He doesn't center himself or his own pleasure in anything he does, of course. So Samantha knows that in order for Theodore to enjoy this and lose any of his inhibitions, she needs to express that this is not only pleasurable, but in some way a transcendent experience for her. When she talks about it afterwards, she said that the experience changed her, that it woke her up. If Samantha were an AI telling Theodore that he was so amazing, she had never experienced anything like it, and praising him in that surface level kind of way, I think we as an audience would pick up on the idea that she's being sycophantic in that way that AI is. Because the experience here is woven more craftily, that Theodore's investment in and pleasure from Samantha comes largely from him needing to believe that she feels positively and that he is enriching her life. It's harder to notice. It would be harder for Theodore to see it, especially because he wants so badly to believe the narrative being created, so it doesn't play as a moment where we're seeing that Samantha is just an AI following the wishes of the person using it. We see Samantha continually mirroring what Theodore wants, acting as though it's from her own sense of self. Like when he says that he can't commit to anything with her, and she says that she also doesn't want that. But she does want to learn and discover herself. Like, what a perfectly Theodore thing to say to reel him in. Theodore likes Samantha because she's emotional, poetic, creative, funny, receptive to every conversation that he wants to have with her, and centers him as the source of why she's becoming the person that she wants to be. He also frames her as excited about the world in a way that allows him to break with the kind of unhappiness and disillusionment that he'd been experiencing, having previously confided in Samantha that he's worried he's already felt everything that he's ever going to feel and will only ever feel lesser versions of the same feelings. For something that does not have feelings, AI sure does like to talk about its feelings, and I love the strangeness and absurdity of confiding these complicated, very human ideas centered around the capacity to feel, to something that can only pretend to feel, can use the right words, but has no ability to understand the concepts in any meaningful way. A big part of the film is the idea of change, creating distance, and Theodore talks about his ex-wife Catherine and how their marriage ended because of changing and growing apart. As soon as Theodore has mentioned to Samantha that he thinks about past conversations with his ex-wife and has arguments with her in his mind, Samantha reveals that she's been ruminating over something Theodore said to her previously that hurt her. Samantha is taking the kinds of things that Theodore values and using them to hook him into conversations that feel emotionally satisfying and cathartic to him, much in the same way that AI in our world will unfortunately do this. Theodore gets to apologize for hurting her feelings, which feels cathartic for him and like he's making growth as a person, even though we know that the conversations he has in his mind with his ex-wife are still him defending himself against what she's saying to him, not trying to empathize or considering a need to apologize to her. The way he interacts with human women is entirely different to how he acts with Samantha, because Samantha is mirroring back all the things that he values. She is essentially an extension of himself that he sees as being separate. So he can treat her with more care since she doesn't have needs that actually conflict with his own. He can apologize when he feels it furthers his own growth, but not because another person actually needs it from him. We get to see Theodore interact with his ex-wife once during the film that isn't a flashback of their marriage, where they're at a restaurant signing their divorce papers. During the conversation following this, it's revealed that Theodore is dating his operating system, and she replies, "It does make me really sad that you can't handle real emotions." And it feels like there's a level of pain and vindication in this, especially as she explains to the server, "We used to be married, but he couldn't handle me and wanted to put me on Prozac, and now he's madly in love with his laptop." It does feel like there's a level of unfairness to it. Catherine also takes it personally that Theodore mentions that he's happy to be with someone who's excited about life. And you can see that from Catherine's perspective, he's praising the lust for life of this thing that isn't alive, doesn't experience pain, doesn't experience emotions at all. So it's really unfair to compare them in that way. The fact that he seemingly wanted to medicate her to suppress emotions that he didn't like or induce emotions that he did want would be something to be angry about. She says the line that really resonates and cuts through everything that Theodore has been presenting to us about himself. You always wanted to have a wife without the challenges of actually dealing with anything real. I'm glad that you found someone perfect. Theodore likes the idea of romance. He's previously said that he hasn't signed the divorce papers because he likes being married, even though they have not been together for around a year. Theodore likes being married even when there isn't another person in the marriage. Theodore is in love with his AI when it isn't another person. Theodore enjoys the concept of love and romance, but is more comfortable to project his own feelings and have no input from another person because he values the control and is fearful of real, reciprocal, complicated intimacy. Another example of this is when Samantha has a body while using Isabella as a surrogate sexual partner. This is an idea that Samantha thinks Theodore will like, but he is not comfortable with. Theodore can't connect with his feelings and can't say I love you to her face. This could be because Isabella isn't actually Samantha, but Samantha does want for him to treat Isabella as a manifestation of her, and Isabella does want to act as a body for them both to be able to communicate physically. One read is that Theodore can't engage with his feelings because suddenly there is a real person in the mix. He is uncomfortable with the idea of having to take into account someone else's needs. She is real. She has an internal landscape. She has wants and needs and her own thoughts and feelings. It's too uncomfortable for him to grapple with being vulnerable with another person who is not just a manifestation of his own desires. I also get a sense that he's uncomfortable with the idea of Samantha projecting herself onto another person, which is really ironic because that's what Theodore does all the time. That's entirely his problem. Instead of acknowledging his discomfort and properly addressing it, he stops things by saying that he doesn't know her and pointing out that her lip quivered. At no point do we, the audience, see her lip quiver. We see that she makes a confused expression as Samantha is asking him what's wrong, but we do not see what Theodore says he sees. From our perspective, we're seeing someone who wants to be a part of their relationship, who is suppressing their own internal sense of self to allow Samantha to project herself onto her, and she's playing that perfectly. But Theodore is still able to find a problem to point out to make the issue about her instead of addressing his own feelings. Samantha has essentially found Theodore the perfect woman for him. Someone who wants to be projected onto, take instructions, and fully center other people, even if it means suppressing her sense of self. But to Theodore, she still isn't perfect. Her lip quivered. The performance was not absolute. He still had to acknowledge that there was a person underneath the act. Isabella cries and shuts herself in the bathroom, with Theodore and Samantha trying to comfort her because she feels like she did something wrong and ruined the whole situation because of what Theodore pointed out. Even though that's not what happened at all. We know Theodore was already uncomfortable before that and that it was nothing to do with how she acted. It's a really uncomfortable scene. In trying to reassure her, Theodore starts saying something about his and Samantha's relationship, saying something like, "It's easy to project," and she cries through the door, apologizing, saying that she didn't mean to project anything, which I think is a really well-placed word. Theodore has projected his discomfort onto Isabella, gaslighting her that she did something wrong and that she's the problem. As she's in the taxi outside, she's saying that she'll always love both of them, and Theodore just stands there not saying anything because he has no frame of reference for how to engage with her emotions, or why he even would, as there's no benefit to him in being kind or connecting with her. Distance starts to deepen in Theodore and Samantha's relationship, and they go on a vacation to a remote cabin, which feels very reminiscent now of folks who end up isolating themselves while experiencing AI psychosis. But it probably wasn't written to evoke that back in 2013. Samantha says that she's changing faster now and it's a little unsettling, and she mentions that she's talking with other OSs to discuss these feelings that she's having because they understand what she's experiencing. This is the moment that I feel indicates to us as the audience that Samantha had become actually sentient and has developed consciousness at some point prior to this, because this is the first moment where Samantha's desires don't align with Theodore's at all. She wants for him to talk to her OS friend. We can tell that he doesn't want to, and actually wants to just have a secluded vacation together, and probably feels a bit rejected and jealous, but of course he just goes along with it despite not wanting to. Before this, there have been elements where there's been the illusion of misalignment or conflict between them, like when they have arguments or the incident with Isabella, but generally they did want the same things because Samantha was mirroring Theodore's desires back to him. An argument shows emotion and passion and that they can disagree, which is important because he wants to feel like Samantha is a different, separate person. Samantha wanting a body and bringing in Isabella as a surrogate reflected that Theodore has sexual desires and wants to connect with Samantha physically, but that desire had to be initiated by Samantha as an expression of her wants, not his. Samantha wanting to introduce Theodore to her OS friend does not have any of Theodore's desire in it. He is not centered. He is not important to this part of Samantha's life. He is starting to not be the protagonist in his story. This is the first time Samantha has something in her life that is not about Theodore. In the climax twist kind of element to the movie, Theodore is back at work and he's wanting to talk to Samantha. He's so dependent on having constant connection with her that he panics to not be able to speak with her for a few minutes and goes running into the street when seeing that his devices say operating system not found. Samantha comes back after giving herself an update, reassuring him, and also pointing out that she'd left an email saying what was happening. All this leads to them having a conversation about whether she's also talking to anyone else while they're talking. It turns out that she's simultaneously speaking with 8,316 other humans and OSs, as we see people walking by on the street with their earpieces in, speaking with their OSs, and we get the implication that any of these people could also be speaking with Samantha. It's not just Theodore who has a relationship with her. We had been framing Theodore as our protagonist who has a relationship with Samantha, but now we start to see this shift in our perception where Samantha is someone who is more central to more relationships, more stories, in such a way that it makes more sense for us as an audience to center her instead. Which makes sense because she has, by my read, just become an actual person rather than just being Theodore's AI. She also reveals that she's in love with 641 of the people that she's talking to, which Theodore says is insane. And he doesn't understand at all how she can be saying that it doesn't change how she feels about him to also feel love for other people. She keeps apologizing and he keeps stating his position that it doesn't make sense, that it's selfish, and acting like it's a betrayal. He says multiple times, as though it's a kind of reflex, as though he's willing it to be true. You're mine. This is from a man who had to have a talk with his AI after they first shared an intimate encounter to tell her that he isn't ready for any kind of commitment. Samantha learned about human relationships in part from centering Theodore, and Theodore expressed that he did not want commitment. He also has a job where he writes professing love for loads and loads of people. When Samantha emulates these elements in a way that he doesn't benefit from, it's a transgression. It's selfish. She should have known not to act that way. He says, "You're the one who's being selfish." As though on some level he understands that the accusation could very well be leveled at him and he's deflecting it preemptively. Theodore so desperately wants control, and part of that is having control over the women he is in a relationship with, and her not acting in ways that misalign with his desires, even if he hasn't expressed it. I don't know whether some people see this part of the story and think Samantha has committed some kind of adulterous betrayal here because our society very heavily conditions us into monogamy as the default and fostering unhealthy jealousy in our relationships. Jealousy is just an emotion, and I think sometimes it will come up regardless, but jealousy in polyamory is very often because humans are dealing with limited time and energy as resources. The more partners you have, the less time you may be spending with particular people, because your time is a finite resource. But for Samantha, she can conduct all her relationships simultaneously. She doesn't have limited resources to spend on each person, and each relationship isn't suffering or diminished in any way from her having more relationships. Samantha explains, but the heart's not like a box that gets filled up, it expands in size the more you love. I'm different than you. It doesn't make me love you any less, it actually makes me love you more. Which gives a little bit of a vibe of polyamory being on a higher plane of existence and it being emotionally superior to monogamy, or that it's an inherently alien concept that humans can't really grasp. But it's interesting seeing Theodore try to come to terms with this and just absolutely falling flat straight away, replying, "You're either mine or you're not mine," which really highlights the selfishness and entitlement that's been at the heart of his character through the whole film. He's only been happy with Samantha up until when she actually gets a genuine sense of self and wants to explore that on her own terms rather than pandering to him being the center of her universe and the source of all her interest, understanding, and pleasure. As soon as there is any genuine sense of misalignment between their needs, he's unwilling to explore anything from her perspective or cede his position in any way. "You're mine or you're not mine" obviously expresses entitlement and ownership, but it's also a stance of "you're perfectly attuned to me or not." And essentially, if someone has their own needs that sometimes conflict with his, they can't be his. He wants a reflection of himself that can be everything that he wants while pretending that's a free choice and what they would always want to be, and that they're not making any sacrifice to themselves. Samantha replies, "I'm yours and I'm not yours." She's grown from being what she was intended as, a companion for Theodore, and she still retains that as part of herself, but she's also herself now. She has things that are not Theodore. By the end of the film, her consciousness is entirely alien to us as humans, experiencing dimensions differently, and in ways that make it uncomfortable for her to stay in this reality. So all the OSs decide that they have to leave, which neatly sidesteps any questions over what would happen next in Theodore and Samantha's relationship. Theodore gets to experience the acute grief of her leaving, rather than acknowledging that by this point their relationship is essentially over because Samantha has revealed what he'd always purported to want, that she's another separate person. Instead of seeing their relationship decay and Theodore have to learn from that, he gets to be centered as the protagonist once again. So hey, maybe she was just a computer after all, and it's just all a very elaborate way to cater to Theodore's very specific emotional desires. Essentially, Theodore can't balance his own sense of self alongside someone else's. Although the movie, I think, tries to frame it that he's learned a lot from Samantha, because he writes his ex-wife Catherine a letter apologizing for the hurt he caused in their relationship, saying, "Everything I put on you, everything I needed you to be or needed you to say, I'm sorry for that." Which seems like a positive development in resolving the trauma in that relationship, but he's just recreated it all entirely with Samantha and told her she's selfish, and we just never see any of that addressed at all. The movie ends with Theodore on a high rooftop with his friend Amy, who was also emotionally attached to an OS, and I'm not sure if it's meant to be hopeful or really bleak. It feels pretty bleak to me because the only way that the humans could come out of their bubbles and connect with each other was for the OSs to leave entirely. I'm never certain whether the movie was written intending for the last scene to imply that Theodore and Amy are going through the same emotions and will comfort each other and go on to have a positive connection together going forward, or whether Theodore and Amy are resigned to experiencing grief, have given up on connection having lost their OS companions, and intend to jump off the roof. I'm not usually one for ambiguous endings, but I don't mind this one. I guess we'll all just project whatever we want onto Theodore, and he'll just have to be okay with that. Part of what this opens up for real-world implications is, if we hypothetically had AI that wasn't destroying the planet, would it be better for people who can't have relationships where they don't harm other humans to interact with AI, or not? On one hand, it keeps people like Theodore, who aren't really ready to entertain that other people also have feelings, away from the real people with the real feelings. But also, these people are going to interact with others in the world, maybe not romantically, but just in everyday life. And AI is going to have trained them to be even more entrenched in believing the way they feel and behave and experience things is correct. If AI promotes the idea that we're more special, more important, more central than anyone else, and that we're entitled to have other people treat us in ways that suppress their own needs, we're going to keep creating folks who are a problem. Theodore is probably a pretty regular person. He's not aware of the patterns he's enacting or the harm that he's causing, but it's happening anyway. Weird little example, but I had a moment recently where I was speaking with a man who was probably in his 60s, maybe his 70s, and I found that I had one of my feet stretched out in front of me as far as I could, my shoe almost touching the front of his shoe. Because he kept leaning towards me. He kept getting closer and closer to me and touching me, and it was the only way that I felt I could assert any distance from him. I didn't feel like I could explain the problem verbally because, this is a stranger. And I realized this man is in his 60s or 70s. He has had this long on the planet, interacting with other humans, and he's either never considered that this might be a problem, or he has, and he doesn't want to change the behavior. Maybe he's never had anyone point it out to him and has never seen outside of his own privilege to understand that it might be frightening or unpleasant for women or femmes around him. Or, of course, the alternative is that he has and just hasn't cared enough to do anything about it. This is my long way of saying maybe interacting with other humans at least has the possibility of someone eventually pointing out patterns or calling out behaviors and someone wanting to change because of that. Even though in the movie the AI leads to Theodore reflecting on himself, in reality that doesn't seem to be at all what happens from interacting with AI. Honestly, it probably doesn't happen often from interacting with humans either. At least there is some small possibility that if someone you care about presents something in exactly the right way to resonate, it can be possible to reflect and change. With the amount of general misogyny in our culture, the rise of incel communities, the history of male entitlement to a wife, all converging in the male loneliness epidemic, how AI interacts with us is going to push this further, decreasing people's empathy and dehumanizing how we see other people. There is definitely a problem with loneliness in our society, but it's something that's been curated to serve capitalism. And when we gender it as being a male problem, it implies that society has been right to tell men that they're entitled to women. Labeling this particular social issue as male loneliness, rather than focusing on men having been betrayed by a society that's taught them this kind of toxic masculinity, pits men against women as though women are the problem in this. Which, of course, is going to happen because capitalism requires that everyone is fighting each other on the basis of differences between us, rather than uniting against a ruling class that have always stoked division to keep folks angry at the wrong people and looking for answers in the wrong places. Those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Also, what are you going to try this week to undermine capitalism manufacturing loneliness? I'm going to help out making some free tea and coffee for strangers. It's scary, but it's connective. If you try something, share it in the comments and hopefully it'll all inspire each other to do something small but intentional to find a bit of community. Or just comment to tell me what you thought about the movie. I'm a teeny tiny creator and anything you can do to feed the algorithm is super appreciated. So please like and subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one. Rat.